Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 35th year, our Emerald Anniversary year, I talk to writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. It's also a home for other brands of artists. We have had on musicians, we have had on sculptors, we've had on painters. So if you have an idea for a writer or other brand of artists who might be appropriate for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd love to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that all the original programming that comes out of 1623 Studios is a result of cable access television. It's a valuable community asset, and it's an important community asset. It's one that you don't get by dish or other means of accessing the internet. So you stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a writer who's coming back. He was on the show during one of our COVID episodes 3 years ago, but he's back to talk about new books. And I'm going to show the books right now in the trilogy that ends with today's focused novel. This is Explorations. This is Retribution. This is the third one, the one we'll be speaking most about today, Redemption. This is a formidable accomplishment, although it's not finished. He's working on other books already, but it's a wonderful accomplishment, and I want to give a very, very warm welcome to the author, David Tory.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for being with us.
That's a pleasure.
I don't want to hold those up for the whole show.
Right.
I think our audience probably might not remember some of the background details. Can you tell us where you grew up and where you went to school?
I was born in England, a place called Sheffield in Yorkshire. My secondary school was a school called Haileybury, what we call a private school in England, or public school we call it in England, a private school. I didn't go to university. My father wanted me to go to his college at Cambridge, and I didn't get there, so he said, "University of Life, my boy." And off I went, and I very early on became a computer programmer. That was in 1962.
What year?
1962. I became.
What were computers then?
They were
cards.
Well,
cards?
Funny you should mention that, because one of the books I'm currently working on is a sort of spy novel set in the 60s, where the protagonist is a computer programmer. Enough of that. But yes, so in computers, and long life in computers, finishing in the United States in 1995. I retired, and then I got involved with started a community foundation.
Oh, when did you come to the United States?
1980.
80.
Yes.
So you've been here for
40-something years.
Yeah.
Still speak with an English accent.
About half a lifetime in England.
That's right, yeah. Although I must say, my friends say that you've developed an American accent, and which I'm shocked about, but there you go.
Really? Well, I can hear clearly your British accent,
right.
Although it's not real strong.
No. Mid-Atlantic or something, yeah.
So people complain about your American accent a little bit.
Right, yeah. I don't think they complain, they comment on it. There's a complaint.
This trilogy is all about Isaac
Stanfield, that's right.
And these are the Stanfield Chronicles. I want to know a couple of tech questions first. From the time you got the concept of this character and this saga to having the third book in hand, how much time was involved?
Probably, I would say 10 years.
10 years.
I started this not because I wanted to write a book. In fact, I never even thought about writing a book. But I was interested in, once I retired from the Community Foundation, I was interested in why it was so difficult to raise philanthropic dollars in New England.
Why was it difficult?
Difficult compared to other places in the United States, according to my colleagues in the business. And so I was going to write a thesis about why it was so difficult and hopefully find causes which could then be dealt with and come up with solutions. And so the first thing I did was sort of think about what was different about New England from everywhere else. And I came up with the Puritans. And I said, well, it presumably has something to do with the Puritan mentality of I give of myself but not of my wealth. And the sort of the typical Yankee New Englander, whatever it might be. But what it meant was that I started doing research into the Puritan influence in New England. And of course, as I dug deeper and started taking notes, I became absolutely fascinated about what I consider to be the untold story of how the Puritans came to be here and the evolution of that whole...
And this is before you had the concept of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Before Isaac existed.
Absolutely, yeah. So it was just a thesis it was going to be. Now, I produced something like 400,000 words that I'd written in notes and books that I'd taken from, and getting the bibliography from old books about the subject and searching the bibliography, finding more books online, and a wonderful bookstore in Manchester called Manchester by the Book, which has a wonderful selection of older books which I bought and consumed. And it reached a point where I said, well, what do I do with all this information? And a friend of mine said, well, why not create a curriculum for a sort of a school or whatever it might be. And then I found that schools have, in America certainly, they have to deal with European history and British history and American history, and they all have one lesson a week or something to do all this. Yeah. The level of granularity I was going into as far as how the Puritans got to be in New England was way too fine for even a tertiary level education, a university level education. So they said, well, then it would suggest, well, why not write a book? And I said, well, it's going to be a very large book because of periods, in that period, given the detail that I had. And then the whole thing evolved, basically. First of all, that I had to make a decision as to whether I was writing a history text or I was writing a story.
Yeah.
And
the form.
And the story had to be compelling as far as possible. So I had to create a character. And if it was going to be historical. Oh, by the way, I came up with a number of conclusions which aren't necessarily acceptable to your bona fide historian. So I made sure it was historical fiction, so I could make sure that never let facts get in the way of a good story. So
you give us an example of one of those.
Well, the essential thing was that when the Mayflower left Plymouth, England in 1620, they were going to the Hudson.
Say that again?
They were going to the Hudson River. They thought they were all going off to the Hudson River because that's where the Dutch had just established an enclave there in New Amsterdam, and they'd come from Leiden in Holland. And so it would seem logical to them that they should be given land by the Dutch in that part of the world. But they never got there. And people say, well, it was a storm, and they landed in Cape Cod because they were blown there. And I'm basically saying that's just a bit too coincidental. And then on top of that, there are other reasons why it was such a good idea for them to go where they went to. First of all, Massachusetts Bay had been very well mapped and charted by Samuel de Champlain in 1606, 1605. Captain John Smith had done a survey of the place, and others. Secondly, the gentleman who was responsible for a lot of the surveying and exploration in New England, called Sir Ferdinando Gorges, had arranged for Native Americans to be captured and brought back to England.
And you mentioned that in the book.
Yeah, to be trained and taught English, and also for the English to learn about what was happening to the North America.
To get a better idea of how to survive over here.
And then sending them back with expeditions. And there were two people, Samoset and Squanto, or the Squantum is called, were actually down in effect waiting for the Puritans to arrive, or the Separatists to arrive in the Mayflower, right where they actually landed, in Tuxet, in that area.
So you became essentially a historian before you became a novelist.
Well,
And you
yeah,
had the problem of, like, filmmakers have 500 hours of footage has to be reduced into two weeks of programming.
well, there you go. Yeah,
10 hours or
that's
something
right.
like that.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was the sort of that was what I found so intriguing about it. And then I said, okay, well, how do I convert this into a story? I've told this story many times before, but when I was brought up, I went to a school before I went to the secondary school. It was a boarding school again. I had a wonderful library, and I was 10 years old, 11, 9, 10 years old, and they had there was a author there called G.A. Henty, 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 who wrote books, historical books, and he wrote about 40 or 50 books. Each one was a story where a young man is the eyewitness to a historical event. Okay, and it could be anything, to the Battle of Waterloo or whatever. And so I was brought up on that. And the idea of having a young man be the protagonist, describing the historical event.
Very immediate.
Yeah, and being part of it, not only observing it, but being a participant.
One of the things I like about the series is that you chose this kind of a half epistolary and half memoir.
Yeah.
It's partly letters, partly a journal.
Yes, it is. That's right.
And that makes it very, very immediate.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of action. This
Well,
Isaac
a
crams
lusty
in
young man, yes.
about 10 lives worth of experience in,
Right,
in 20 years.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very much so.
So-
He calms down a little towards in the third book.
So I have a side question. I want to make sure I stay on my schedule here. Was the idea of New England and simply the name influential on you moving to New England from Great Britain?
Me personally.
For you, yes.
Oh,
Because I'm going to go to New England because I'll feel at home there. You know.
No, not particularly. I came here because I was transferred here by a company that acquired my company and had asked me to go to. In fact, we went to Long Island. A company was called Computer Associates, and I went there as a senior manager in their office in Long Island. And then I was headhunted to run a software company in Cambridge, where I came up to Massachusetts. So it was work related that caused me to come to the United States.
So you've been in Massachusetts ever since?
And I've been in Massachusetts since 1988. Yes.
88.
Yeah.
And you're still here.
I'm still here.
You're not tempted to go to Florida or go back to Great Britain?
No, we go back regularly. We have a house in the
you
Lake
mentioned
District.
earlier before we went on the air.
Yeah.
You have a house in
Lake District.
in northwestern England.
Yeah.
I love being in England. I wouldn't want to live there. The weather makes New England look enjoyable.
Well, yes. My granddaughter is currently touring around Scotland, and she's been there for a week, and it hasn't stopped raining. For the whole week she's been there, and she's actually she's hitchhiking around and living in bivouacs and things.
Every time I see a documentary about Scotland, I understand why they invented Scott. Get through the winter.
Yes, keep themselves warm. Yeah.
I'd like to know. Now, I forgot this. I was going to use for the introduction.
Oh, yes.
Your paragraph from the back back of the novel.
Yeah.
But there's a couple. I'm going to read it anyway.
I'll do that.
Even though it's out of order,
yeah.
because it has to do so much with the content of the novel. David Tory has sailed the coasts of Massachusetts and Maine for 30 years. He brings other settings alive through his familiarity with Dorset, England, and his intimate knowledge of Bermuda and its waters. Years of research, which you've just described, give his books a firm grounding in historic facts and figures while allowing his imagination to use his fictional characters to tell a compelling story of the turbulent early history of New England. Background information on that history can be found on davidtoryauthor.com. We're going to show your website on air when
Now, the website is actually important because as I was extracting a lot of the historical fact out of the books, because there was too much, I didn't want to get in the way of the actual story, I used the website as a repository for a lot of the historical information that I'd gathered. So I developed the website basically as a way of moving interesting information, factual information, people and events and places and activities and so on, onto the website to be a source of information. So it was
kind of an online library.
Online library, yeah, that's right.
Because your background is in computers, did you do all your website work?
Yeah. Well, I use WordPress. So it's very, very straightforward.
You use WordPress?
I use WordPress.
You confess to that.
Are we allowed to advertise? Yes, why not? Not on the BBC. Yes, WordPress.
Well, maybe that's your company.
No, not at all. No.
Your website is very, very, very nice looking, and fits the dignity needed for these. The
dignity.
Well, these are dignified
I like
books.
that word.
Although I got to say, the book moves along, and there's violence, there's jealousy, there's love, there's sex, there's hate, full of stuff.
Yeah.
None of it gratuitous. It's necessary to the plot. Plot keeps rolling along. You mentioned earlier Champlain coming to Beauport, and I have marked a chapter 19. I wonder if I could get you to read a couple of sentences, maybe a paragraph from chapter 19.
Yeah. What, from the start?
Because chapter 19 is relevant to our television audience.
Okay. Well, this is journal entry, August 1629. It was a week before we were able to set off on our exploratory trip around Cape Ann. Annie remained concerned about the possibility that Seth was lurking in the bushes. I'd planned to take Johnny with me, but he also voiced his misgivings. He thought we'd come to a too convenient, even if plausible, explanation. He said he would prefer to stay with Gavin and Giles to ensure there would be no intruders, or if there were, to deal with them. He'd contacted his Indian friends, who said they would keep a watch as well. With those assurances and protection, Annie was happy to see David and me leave. She did recognize the importance of our finding a new home and ensured we had supplies and provisions for 2 weeks, more than enough. We sailed east along the Massachusetts Bay shoreline of Cape Ann, passing numerous islands and entrances to natural harbors and bays. We did a quick tour of Beauport Harbor. I told David about my earlier visits over the years and the attempts to establish a settlement there 6 years previously. We sailed on around the end of Cape Ann, heading north, then west as we skirted the northern shoreline. We passed a river mouth, which seemed to be flowing directly southward back to Beauport Harbor. We continued past a long sandy beach to another narrow entrance to what looked like a large bay guarded by huge sandbars. There was an ebbing tidal flow out of the entrance, close to the slack water, as we sailed into the bay and beached Rosie to the west, sheltered by a high sand dune. We climbed to the top of the dune for a better view of the bay, which was surrounded by a heavily wooded shoreline receding into the distance with a hilly landscape to our right. What looked like a river meandered its way around the far side of the bay, the view blocked in part by a mass of marsh grass growing in the middle of the bay. It was entrancing. Evening was drawing in, with the sinking sun making the distant land indistinct. The water was calm, with wildfowl in abundance. That was Essex. That's the
very, very nice. The sailing along Maine and Massachusetts, as mentioned in the bio blurb, came in handy for much of the book. Now, the Isaac Stanfield was born in England, but he spends more and more time here, and often in Salem, on the North Shore.
That's right.
And he becomes, I can't say an American citizen because there's no American country there at that time. This is all
resident.
This is all
brings his family here. That's right.
17th century, early 17th century. I think he's a lad of 16 when the first volume starts, and 16 13.
Yeah,
And then it ends in
1632.
1632.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's got about 10 lifetimes jammed in there in that 20 years. It's really, it moves along very, very nicely, smoothly. It doesn't look, it's well researched, but the research is always secondary. I read some books where it's clear they're going to get every last fact in, no matter what. And in fact, I just stopped reading a book like that. But that's not the case here. It's very fluid, interesting interesting prose, and interesting scenario, interesting plot. I'm going to mention, because I don't want to forget this, that these 3 books would be a wonderful idea for a Christmas gift. And Christmas is only, about a month and a half, 2 months off. So keep that in mind when you're looking for something impressive to give to a loved one that you want to impress.
Well, these are you can get them on Kindle. So there is an ebook. The first 2 have been I've done the audio recording of, and available. And the third one I'm going to start fairly soon. The audio.
You recorded them.
I did record. I recorded them. Yeah. I have I converted a cupboard into a recording studio in my house, and I bury myself away there doing recording.
So that's very relaxed. If you have to do a cut and retake.
Oh well, yeah. It's fun doing it because I'm a frustrated actor. So the idea of doing it. But actually, what's interesting is I got a very, very bad review because for one of the audio recordings I did. And I thought I was a bit disturbed by it, and I found that in fact, when people record books, you've got 3 different types of recording. You either do a narrative, like you're reading a book to like your friend or child, or you do voice acting, and you have a voice actor doing the different parts and different characters, and he's dramatizing it, if you like. And then the third way is where you have a group of people taking different parts. And it's just like a play reading that they're doing it on. And this particular person wanted it to be a voice actor doing all the different characterizations of all the
an individual doing the different
one person doing all the different parts.
I don't listen to books.
Oh, well, there you go.
I know what you mean, what you're referring to, of course. Yeah. But I don't listen to anything in the car. I can't even stand to have the radio on.
You're old Luddite, aren't you, really?
I want to ask some more questions about the 3rd book, Redemption.
Yeah.
Let me see. What of David Tory's background in England and David Tory's character has gone into Isaac Stanfield?
Well, that's true. That's true. All 3 books. I think it's. I don't know how many other authors have this same situation when they're writing about a particular protagonist. But I found that I became Isaac, or Isaac became me, or whatever it was. And in writing it, and in fact, even in the next book, I'm finding no matter how many notes I take. And I've got the timeline, and I've done a sort of a storyboard, if you like, what I want to do. Once you sit down and start writing, the character takes over, and he starts taking you down in directions that you hadn't necessarily plotted, and you're not quite sure. Which is the point where I basically say to Isaac, "Okay, Isaac, what happened next?" And I'm trying.
What would Isaac do in this situation?
And it was really not so much Isaac was telling me what he would do. I mean, I'm not saying, "Okay, Isaac, what happened next?" He'd just be, "Okay, I'll take over. Thank you. Just take dictation with you." Almost.
Yeah.
It's like that. And you after a few minutes, you sit back and you read it's not what you thought you were going to write.
It's close to automatic writing.
It's evolved because the persona. Yeah. Your persona and the persona of the protagonist becomes merged, melded, and it's fascinating. It really is, and therefore and makes it very enjoyable, in fact, to write.
So you're not bored or tired after writing 3. You're working on 4 and 5. You said
well,
before
there are two different books, yeah, but the fourth book, which we're getting into rather quickly, but what happens is that there are a number of congruent stories in the three books.
Yeah.
There's the historical narrative that feeding all this and the events and the people. There's also Isaac's journey and his coming of age and his development as an individual through that process. But also it's a love story.
Several love stories.
Well, yeah, but there are two primary ones. There's Abby, who's his wife, first wife, and Annie, who's his second wife. But Annie seduces Isaac before he even marries Abby, even though he was betrothed to Abby at the time. So very complicated. But the point is that there's those stories, Abby's story in the first book, and then Annie all the way through all three books. And James, the first child, born at the end of book one, grows as a child right the way through the end of the third book. So if in reading it, you realize, in fact, that Isaac's developing a persona of his own, a substantial persona of his own. So the fourth book starts in 1638. The third book ends in 1632.
There's a jump there.
There's a jump. And it's now in the third person, the story. So it's a narrative story.
Oh, you narrate.
And it's the story of James, or
his son.
One of the escapades of James.
I'm watching the clock. We're almost out of time.
Oh, dear.
And I've enjoyed this, and I lost track of the time. Because we can't go over because then the people whose shows follow mine will get ticked off.
All right.
But I want to thank you for being with us and talking about this very impressive trilogy, the third book of which is Redemption, the one we're emphasizing tonight, and talking about Isaac and all his adventures. Who knew that there was adventure and sex in the 17th century? Huh? Thank you. I want to thank David for being with us.
Pleasure. I'm delighted.
I've enjoyed the books, and I'm impressed by the book, and I hope our audience will be too.
Me too, yeah.
I want to thank our television audience as well for being with us. If you've learned something about historical fiction and this swashbuckling, really exciting trilogy called The Stanfield Chronicles by David Tory, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next time on the Writer's Block. Good night.